Hi, I'm Jared Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. My guests today are Heidi Korsavong and Benjamin Critton, the co-founders of the Los Angeles-based gallery MARTA. Founded in 2019, MARTA makes, as they say, space for artists to experiment with the utility of design and for designers to explore the abandonment of function. It's this interest in the interdisciplinary, or even the anti-discipline, that I think makes the work they show so exciting. The work often feels like it's in process, like we're seeing an artist explore new mediums for the first time. This sensibility, this curatorial purview, I think, is really rooted in Heidi and Benjamin's own background. Before opening MARTA, they both worked as designers, both independently and collaboratively. Heidi's background is in furniture and interiors, and Benjamin's is in graphic design and typography. Incidentally, Benjamin designed Space Mono, the typeface that we used on the very first version of the album art for this podcast 10 years ago. In this conversation, though, I was curious to hear how this background in design informs and shapes the work they do today running MARTA. We start this conversation talking about the curatorial frameworks that shape the gallery and their interests in, as they describe it, the side quests of artists, the work they do outside of the main thing. We talk about how they work with artists and how they choose work to show and put shows together, and how their own understanding of MARTA and what MARTA could be has evolved. In the second half, we talk about their backgrounds across furniture, interiors, graphic design, typography, and how that informs what MARTA is. We talk about the typeface Benjamin designed for Heidi when they first met, which is now the typeface used across all of MARTA's design work, and how that collaboration was developed. If you like this show and what we do here, you can support our work by joining our Substack. We have a monthly newsletter that is free for everybody, as well as a paid tier that gets you a bonus interview each month and really helps keep this show free for everybody all the time. I say on every episode, I want this show to feel like a great conversation in a coffee shop that you're listening in on. And really, for the price of a cup of coffee a month, you can help us do this work and put more of it out into the world. I really couldn't do it without you. Heidi Korsavong, Benjamin Critton, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having us.
You describe MARTA, the gallery that you founded in LA in 2019, as making space for artists to experiment with the utility of design and for designers to explore the abandonment of function. Tell me what that means. What does that look like?
That's such a good question. We wrote that pretty early on in the gallery's life cycle. It still feels mostly true, like 80% true. But I think it's also kind of nice even to note that it's changed and sort of shifted and morphed and mutated from that sort of more like binary modus operandi of like this doing that and that doing this, to encompass kind of hopefully a much wider spectrum of practices, some of whom don't even trade in the word art or design, or do so really seldomly. But I think where it comes from is a really like core fascination with malleable practices and creative producers who are interested in sort of stepping over disciplinary lines, or refuting what they've known up to that point, or being voracious about a new thing. Yeah.
I think too, it was just in some ways an invitation for experimentation. A lot of the studio visits that we were doing, there would be these kind of moments off in the corner where like a failed experiment or something that had promise, but it kind of it was a little bit outside of the artist's kind of general output or body of work that we were more familiar with. And it kind of grew out of those moments of saying, you know, a potter saying, I think I've made my first piece of sculpture. There's no function. And those kinds of moments were really interesting to us. And so I think that that statement really grew out of those kind of experimental interactions.
I want to hold on one thing that you said, Benjamin. You said you feel like it's 80% true. And so I guess I'm curious, I have kind of a two-part question there. Is the 20% where it's not true, is that about the sort of the blurriness or the messiness that you feel like has emerged? Like it's no longer binary? Like I guess the question I'm asking is like, is the binariness of that statement the piece that feels troublesome or only 80% true now? Or is it
Yeah.
about this kind of like kind of failed experimentation or kind of jumping? Tell me about like
Yeah.
the
I think
80-20 split a
the
little more.
20% holds, and that is not an accurate number or even
Right.
coming from anywhere mathematical. But what it holds is, I think that maybe in the last 6 years since the gallery started, maybe also like there are certain artists or designers or whatever they call themselves, we don't really prescribe that title, um, who are more clear-headed from the get-go about occupying liminal space. So it
Mm,
could have been that 6 years ago, the painter had to make a really cognizant decision of saying, I'm going to make a chair for the first time, and not make a painting. And now, um, just for the sake of this example, I think maybe there's a couple artists out there who are like, hey, from the get-go, I'm going to make a chair painting. And I don't even know what that means. Do you know, but like that they're from the start maybe looking um, at a practice that's more inherently in between.
mhm.
So I think that's part of the 20%. And I think the other part of the 20% is that now, as the gallery has grown a little bit, as we, have seen and see more amazing works that both we seek out and that kind of now magically come to us in a really beautiful way. Um, there are people who came up as painters and who still call themselves painters and who we then say, hey, we would really love to host your paintings. You know what I mean? So
Right, right.
there's, while we're still interested in those little experiments that they might have off on the side, um, in fact, sometimes now we are not provoking that artist to explore that space. We're falling in love with a body of work that actually is just more concrete and resolute in and of itself. Um, and so that's where the other maybe part of that 20% is.
I promise I won't spend this whole conversation talking about a sentence that you wrote at the beginning to define
I
the
doomed
gallery, but
it.
I do have like one and a half other questions about it.
Cool.
Because I am curious about that binary artists to experiment with the utility of design and designers to explore the abandonment of function, regardless of how, the strictness of that, how much you are bound to the strictness of that binary today. I am curious about how that maybe shaped those early years. The fact that that is a binary, do you think that that was helpful in um, articulating a vision for yourself about what Marta could or was going to be?
Yes. And I also think that it became a really kind of inadvertently, we didn't write that as a sort of as an open call in any way, but I think for the first little while, let's say like the first 2 to 2.5 years of the gallery, it also did kind of inadvertently function as a little bit of an invitation in some ways, where we had a couple of great shows, and if not shows, interactions or projects and things like this with folks who saw themselves in that statement, and were kind of maybe had one clear path, but they were like really on the fork of the path and not the path itself.
Mm-hmm.
or um, maybe they'd been trained in one thing and saw a glimmer of this other potential path. That I think that the world of commercial galleries is not often open. I think it often inadvertently asks someone, an artist, to pick a lane.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Right.
and so I think what that did is it had the effect of also kind of being like, come over into this tent and like we'll see what's what.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, and it speaks to where I was going with that question, which that last piece about the like come into this big tent where like all this kind of stuff is possible. What I found as a graphic designer who makes podcasts and writing that that when you start to jump between lanes, it gets a lot harder to communicate what you do or how all of those things fit together. And I'm struck by the 6 years of Marta, the evolution of that original mission, the openness that it has become, the less rigid kind of boundaries. How do you describe what it is now? I mean, there's a couple of things. There's this idea of like going between lanes or like starting a new thing or uh liminal space, working in the liminal space, this idea, Heidi, that you were talking about of like the failed experiment or that thing in the corner of the studio. What ties all of these shows together now? Do you still feel like there's a clear kind of point of view coming from the two of you?
Yes. Every now and again, we'll put work together in some sort of group show. I mean, the best representation of this is not something we've done regularly, but we did one show in, I think, 2023 or 2024. It was called Rites of Spring.
Mm,
And it was, I mean, candidly speaking, it was sort of an in-between point in the gallery's programming, and we were, it was a sort of maybe a shorter runway than we normally like to give ourselves in the sort of fomenting and creation and presentation of an exhibition. But we also had a lot of great work around us, that hadn't found homes of collectors yet,
mm,
and we put together a group show that was sort of at least one to three works from virtually every artist in the program, and a little bit of like a mini retrospective. It was sort of like just about to be kind of like our 5 year anniversary of the gallery, and we put all these works together in the space here, and they were from shows that were really um, conceived from very different places, each and every one of them, and the work like all hung out really beautifully together, not
mm,
only formal perspective, but it kind of bounced around each other, in conceptual ways and in visual ways and in even colors. Like it was strange because we were sort of like, it was also this really nice moment of being like, oh, this all there's a through line here.
yeah.
Uh, and it's not to generalize these artists' practices because they're all vastly different, but it was also kind of heartening to be like, oh, okay, interesting. Like um this is us kind of,
Mm-hmm.
having a POV. And somehow kind of all this work is hanging out with one another. And I don't think we've tried to like put language to why that is, other than maybe some of the things we're talking about, that a lot of the work comes from kind of bouncing in between disciplines or
I think it's like there's this. It's good that you pointed to that show. Because it's a good like visual thing to look at
yeah.
and kind of understand maybe what those commonalities are. And for me, as you're talking about it, the only thing that keeps like coming up is this like generosity of spirit.
Yeah.
Like
Mm,
there's this like abundance and kind of
mm,
positivity like running through it, but
Yeah.
the practices are all widely different, but we actually happen to work with really kind of wonderfully creative and positive. And I don't know, there's just a lot of generation that is happening in in those practices. And maybe that's
Yeah.
kind of what you're speaking to.
Yeah, that's very well said. I mean, I do think that maybe some of what we are catching or picking up on in a given artist practice is this sort of um, generosity is a great word for it.
Yeah.
But I think it dovetails with their, the result is a generosity to the recipient, not only us, but like, the viewer or the collector, or the institution, or, whoever's kind of dialogue interacting with the show. But maybe from the artist's point of view, it does have to do maybe with some of what we were talking about at the start before we even kind of hit record, with this kind of like wide
Yeah.
spectrum of
Yeah.
curiosity, of being, you know, of being, kind of not myopically focused on one goal, but being kind of charmingly curious about all these nodes. And maybe they I don't know a good example. Maybe they make an accident, like they have an accident in the studio, and that's actually the path they
Yeah.
go down.
Yeah.
It's the path of like fixing the accident, or like, sort of like staying on the path and kind of amending what may have gone wrong, but rather kind of, yeah, embracing this little side quest.
Yeah.
I can't help but come back to video game metaphors sometimes, like
Okay.
the side quests and the Easter eggs and these other things that are sort of bandied about in talking about video games and video game language. I do feel like a real kinship with, because I think often the best bodies of work come from an artist's side quest.
Yeah. Yeah.
This thing that they've gotten pulled by, whether they know it or whether they want it or not.
As someone who has not been to the gallery, as someone who's watched the gallery from the other side of the country, as I was preparing for this, I was trying to articulate that point of view for myself, going into this interview, and there were two words that I wrote down as the best. And again, I don't want this to sound like I am putting all of your artists together as one or making them sound similar. But these two words kept coming up for me as I was thinking about your work, and one was process, and I think that's also what you're saying when you're talking about kind of generosity. There's a sense that these are both works in process, that they are like, it almost feels like they're being developed in real time. We get to see inside of the process in some way, and I think maybe some of that is that generosity, but some of that is also this sense of, it's the side quest. It's this artist is trying a new process or doing something new. And the other word that came up to me was texture, and I was struck by how much I wanted to touch everything on the website. All the shows, there's a very strong sense of materiality, of a consciousness about the materials being used and why. And I think that speaks to process in some way too. Also, I'm wondering what if those words mean anything to you, or if you have any thoughts on this idea of process, whether that's artistic process, design process, and how that kind of has a place in the gallery, but also just the sheer amount of material and texture that you have shown over the years. How do you feel about that?
Great.
All
I
right,
know.
next
I
question.
think
Okay.
yeah, done. Um, I feel great about that, because it's great that even from afar, that I'll start with texture, and then maybe it can lead back to process. It's great to hear that these kind of tactilities are making their way through the screen, and that they're still kind of like imbuing excitement on the
Hmm.
receiving
Yeah.
end, because they imbue even more excitement in person. But it's
Right.
great that some of that is still being conveyed, through not only the work itself, but it's also its representation and its sort of presentation, whether via Instagram or the website, or what have you. I think when I had the first notions that Heidi and I could have a gallery together, some of it came from designing books for artists or for architects or for designers, in which it was so tantalizingly frustrating to place a high resolution image
Hmm.
into a book layout and
Hmm.
InDesign and not be able to touch it,
Yeah.
uh, or to just to really want to be able to get closer to the work. And sometimes if that was an artist that was in New York, or when we lived in New York, or in LA when we lived in LA, that I would invite myself over
Hmm.
to understand what the valley was between the image and the work. And some of the impetus of opening the gallery was, both Heidi and I, we love books. We own a lot of books. It was wanting to get closer to the contents of those pages,
Yeah.
or you could say the same about a screen, wanting to get closer to that, sort of digitally
Yeah.
mitigated
Yeah.
JPEG or TIFF or file or whatever that's being presented to you. So I think no matter what, that like maybe we almost are attracted to work that we know is going to convey that
Mm.
through those
Yeah.
through the limited capacity of those images. Um, and then even it rewards even more when you're right there next to it. But maybe, yeah, maybe it also comes just from like working with images and looking at so many images and wanting to make sure that even someone who is quote unquote receiving this work from afar, through that image is rewarded by it, or
Yeah.
can feel close to it, or wants or desires to
Yeah.
touch it.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's this other little image floating around in my head, which is the museum stance. And I've made this little like kind of New Yorkery cartoon in my head about it, but I don't know what the punchline is, other than that the person standing, in pick your institution, MoMA or the Getty, or wherever, with their hands kind of clasped behind their back, is literally just trying to not touch the artwork.
Right.
Like
Right.
literally, like
Right.
it's like, oh, I really want to see, I want to understand how the person put those paint strokes together, and I know I can, I could get closer to it if I could just touch it. Or I could get closer to understanding if I could just touch it. What's beautiful about a lot of the works that we do host here is that one can. Yeah, that's not true of every work, and some are more delicate than others, are more um, kind of like verboten to touch than
Hmm.
others.
Hmm.
But the show we have up right now, for example, Isabel Rower's Imago, the chair works that she's made, speaking of generosity, are tremendously generous, not only in their sort of posture and stance and sort of ergonomics, but also they really reward that curiosity of touch. And we for those works specifically, do not, we look over them, but we do not dissuade that touch.
Mm.
And I think it's really interesting to note that, yeah, that it's exciting. On the one hand, it's problematic in a gallery setting where where the work is commercially available. But on the other hand, it's really exciting to see someone have like feel a sort
Yeah.
of irresistibility to that work. Um, because I think we feel that way about it too.
So one thing I was going to say, which is a little off topic but close, is I do think it's interesting that there are a couple shows that we've had, like Kristen Wentrack and Andrew Zebulon with the foam works, or even Isabel Rower's earlier body of work, the Boxwork series. There was this material confusion that
Mm. Hmm.
a lot of them, where that kind of irresistible tactility was there, but it was a real question of what that material was.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
the box works, people thought it was corten steel or leather or, all of these things. And there was this kind of moment of touch that you could really see someone's reaction shaped by the actual physicality. And very much so with the foam works by Wentrek Zebulon. It's always a real delight to see the body in interaction with these kind of materially confusing pieces.
Yeah. And I also love this idea of seeing the image of something versus seeing the real thing. The urge to touch, I think, is exactly right. I read an interview that you two gave recently, and in that interview, you said we function ostensibly as a commercial gallery for artworks and design objects, but the gallery often feels like an entity or an idea more than it does an enterprise. Marta seems capable of platforming quite a lot of endeavors or initiatives under the guise of gallery. Tell me about your relationship to that word gallery. Why that feels like a good word for what you're doing, but also how you're exploring the expansiveness of what a gallery itself can be.
Yeah, I mean, I think we think of the gallery as a physical space, and that feels like the right terminology for the house, for the works that we are showing. But the Marta feels like an idea, and
Mm,
the whole space happens to be one kind of aspect of that, I think. And you know, the way that that idea gets expressed in other kind of more flexible ways is through the publication program. Whether it was in the early days, it was a place where, you know, I think like a physical publication is really lovely because it allows the exhibition or kind of the adjacent research or kind of ideas surrounding that to live much longer than the actual presentation itself. And that was a really wonderful thing that we were able to do because of Benjamin's background. And also it just allowed us to kind of be more democratic in
mm,
the lectureship. There, you know, when we came to this, that was kind of how we were able to satisfy a lot of our collecting proclivities. Like you see the books that are behind us, there were, you know,
yeah.
exhibitions that we loved. And so that, you know, felt really important. And then I think kind of now zooming to 2025 when Marta Editions was born, that was another way to kind of keep this democratic kind of accessibility, and also to begin to work with artists in different mediums that maybe aren't, you know, physical sculpture in this way, and kind of, I don't know, allow the gallery to be a little bit more expansive, or to kind of travel outside of these physical boundaries that we had set up at with the gallery.
I want to hold on the idea of the gallery being a physical space for a second, because something that struck me in researching for this conversation, just looking at how you've been written about over the years, I was really struck by how often the word community comes up in talking about the gallery itself, but also your work, the artists that you are bringing together. And I'm wondering how you think about that word community and how that plays into what Marta is and can be, and kind of how you think about, you know, developing or fostering community in the gallery space and in your like geographic location.
I think that community is really important to the existence of Marta, and it allows it to be so much more than just the two of us and what we're able to achieve. I think, you know, it's kind of great that that phrase generosity of spirit came up much earlier, because I think that
Right.
that is a is something that kind of Marta as a space and for openings, and you know, the gallery, I think can be a place that encourages like a meeting point and a place to gather, a place of care, a place of resource sharing. And you know, like we see that happening really organically. It's like putting generous people together. This
Yeah.
kind of recent show that we opened this year, where it was, you know, 22 different woodworkers in the LA area. There are some that are much further along in their career, and then folks that are just starting out. They're organically resource sharing, and um, I think that Yeah, we're just providing kind of like the space for those interactions to kind of happen organically. Even and I think it helps too that some of our artists have teaching backgrounds. So there is in that imbued a
Yeah.
generosity of spirit. George Sherman, who is a ceramicist that we work with in Pasadena, he and his wife were educators for 50 years, and they're still running kind of workshops teaching artists in our program who are enthusiastic and curious how to do ceramics for the first time or things like that. So it is a
Yeah.
really kind of beautiful thing that happens outside of our purview.
And has happened without our vision for it.
Mm.
Which is all to say, like, we we love that that is a byproduct of this set of endeavors. Um, but when we opened a gallery, it wasn't part of the modus operandi. We wanted to platform the work at first, and it's
Right.
so wonderful to see that a natural, natural byproduct of that is this sort of resource sharing, kind of like it's a big statement, but kind of like a breaking down of walls.
Mm.
Also, I think the the internet writ large like can is amazing and fraught for a number of reasons that are often the very same reasons, but it does set up sometimes these boundaries, and I think sometimes like at an opening here at the gallery, for example, where you see kind of maybe someone whose work you've admired from afar, or who you felt maybe was even like, I don't know, a little kind of untouchable, either in I don't know how to say it. I think it sort of greases the wheels also for people to get closer to the
Mm.
inputs that they might have had, and to understand kind of like where that person might be coming from, or where that work might be coming from, and then also, I don't know, like serves this function of like making goals more viable. I think when the young artist looks towards an older artist practice, they not only romanticize it, but they also um, they build it up in a really important and meaningful way. And I think, often what happens is sometimes, we'll be privy to a conversation between two artists, and one who is perhaps less along in their career than the other will say, like, I've been looking at your work from afar for, X number of years, or I've admired your work for X number of time, and I think that the natural outcome of that is also sort of like a levelizing, like
Mm-hmm.
an
Mm-hmm.
acknowledgement of different, sets of skills and perhaps
Mm-hmm.
different experiences and things like this, but also kind of like a flattening of hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I shouldn't say hierarchy because it's not real. It's totally
Yeah.
perceived.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, that I think is really beautiful to watch and see, and I think that's been a really nice um, community as byproduct of presenting shows, and this other thing as a byproduct of community, where all of a sudden someone will be making a new body of work, and if you trace back why they've done that, it's like because George let them use their kiln,
Yeah.
or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
Just like these kind of really, and sometimes infrastructural
Yeah.
things that are actually allowing new bodies of work to be made, or breakthroughs to happen in an artist's practice.
Yeah, I mean, this is making me think of a lot of things I really relate to that, and I think not to draw connections between your work and my work, but I think some of what I try to do is to ask questions to get somebody to think out loud, to almost in a way to show that they don't have all the answers. We often we'll hear these people
Totally.
give their
Totally.
their monologues where everything is scripted, but to kind of think out loud, I think that makes you see their work differently when you hear them articulate something, for the first time. I find that to be a very kind of profound moment where you like see somebody kind of thinking about their work in a different way, or somebody saying something that makes them think about their work in a different way.
And in a way, maybe that relates back to process,
Yeah.
right? Where it's
Yeah.
like the work that we are showing is often also really embracing,
Yes.
let's say the thought process
Yes.
between an inkling and a resolution.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And maybe that's also why we're so fascinated by those conversations themselves, is there's an analog there to like to the work also.
Yeah, yeah. Can we talk about those conversations in your relationship with artists? And I'm not even sure I have all the language for this question, but I imagine that there are a range of types of relationships that you have with artists. There's the artist where you maybe you're showing their work or you're curating a body of work that they've made for the gallery. I imagine there's times where you're commissioning new work or kind of generating new work to be shown. There are times where you become the representation for the artist and you're responsible for showing and selling their work. How do you think about those different levels? How do you engage with artists in different ways? And then tell me a little bit about those conversations that you have when you're visiting the studio and learning about their practices.
Yeah. Um, Gosh, it's a big question, and some of it happens without us even like knowing what's happening in a really nice way. They really do run the gamut, but I think one thing that we've learned, and we maybe touched on it in a previous question, but like one thing we've learned is that so much of this endeavor, and indeed this business, when it is a business, um, has to do with kind of chemistry, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
Um, in the same way that chemistry with a partner or with a friend is like you find yourself drawn to certain people more than others, and that's just the truth of it. And certainly there's been work that we've fallen in love with, and we realize that we don't have chemistry with the maker of that work.
Mm.
And and that's okay because someone else will, you know what I mean?
Hmm. Hmm.
But I think when we know we're pretty good kind of reads of character now, even sometimes in a first studio visit, you can tell kind of within moments, and sometimes it's literally from looking around and seeing certain either touchstones or newness in that artist's sort of
Yeah.
studio or space that you're sort of like, I think we're gonna get along great. You know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
and 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 then it's sort of like not a relationship like any other, because it's not like any other, but it I think we have to feel a certain kinship with an artist beyond solely the work that they make. Um, and
On a
that
personal level, you mean that there's a personal relationship there also, not just a relationship with you and
inevitably,
the
but
work.
it's less about like shared biography
Right.
and maybe it's a little more like almost like borderline spiritual, where you
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
you feel a
Hmm.
connection with that person. And yeah, anyway, I think then what happens pretty organically is that you or we grow into a place with an artist where, it's interesting that word of representation, for example, we don't have like a hard R
Mm.
representation model at the gallery, but oftentimes that's like a result of a really good relationship,
Yeah.
that an artist is presented with an opportunity and they knock on our door to kind of workshop that thing and like and say like, hey, someone knocked on my door about this thing. Like what do you guys think? My thought is this, and we
Yeah.
we just like hash it out. That's like a really ideal place for us to be with an artist, where they can trust in our sort of judgment or proclivities or pathways or guidance, and that we can conversely trust in theirs, not only to guide themselves but to guide us. And I think it's like a very rare business where the actual like the business model is actually like pretty synced up with a kind of like dichotomy of like representation and artist, and that like, and we can talk about this as like candidly as we want, like in general, when an artwork is sold in a gallery, the splits are 50-50 down the middle, and there is this sort of like, there's exactly the same amount of skin
Hmm.
in the game shared by both parties. And so I don't know, I think that there's like a real there's a sort of I don't know, like an analog there where like where you do really have to kind of like meet the other person or the other entity sort of in the middle there. Yeah, and
Yeah.
so going back to your initial question, we interact with artists almost every day in a number of different mediums, and it takes lots of different forms, from like, the most kind of overly formal introduction email to the most casual, set of texts or
Mm.
WhatsApp messages about, a deadline or a joke, it really does kind of run the gamut. And at some point we just kind of consider one another as, I think, like friends that happen to be on and off business partners.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's interesting too because, as professional as we kind of try to approach relationships, it's quite a personal business. You're
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
quickly ensconced in like quite personal details
Yeah.
of someone's life, their home, often family members,
Yeah.
because we're showing people's first, second bodies of work, and what that brings is their community and their family. And
Yeah.
so I mean, it's a really wonderful kind of expansive like orbit that each or constellation that each artist kind of brings to that table, but it does become personal very quickly. So chemistry is so important.
Yeah. Yeah, generally really happy way where, yeah, where what like biography becomes, if an artist especially is making work, kind of from themselves or even about themselves, you're right into the kind of zone of sort of like mutual
Yeah.
therapy
Yeah.
and like
Yeah.
um
I mean, as I've said this before, I think probably on the show I've said this, that the this reminds me of kind of how I think about editing and being edited in writing, and I find that editor writer relationship for me is the most it's the most intimate professional relationship that I have, and they're also the ones that I cherish the most, and the people who have edited my work, and I hope the people whose work I've edited. Are the ones that are, I don't want to use the word friendship because I don't actually know for friends because it is professional,
I
but it
understand. Maybe that
feels the
presumption is the
most like,
last thing to say.
yeah. And there is that trust, and there's that intimacy that comes with the kind of sharing of ideas, and both of you having skin in the game to make those ideas better in some way. And the way you're sort of talking about this is reminding me of that. And it connects to something, Heidi, that you said earlier about kind of visiting a studio and seeing some experiment in the corner and saying, like, tell us about that. Like, what's that over there? How, I don't want to ask you how you do that, but I'm curious about that when.
I can tell you exactly how she does it, and it's so beautiful. She'll if it's an object that can be picked up, she'll pick it up and she'll say, "What's this?" And no, and I'm serious. That's her intonation, and it's a really beautiful thing because oftentimes it is something that the artist feels a kinship with.
Okay,
And I think
that's where I was going with this. Yeah.
that's maybe Heidi's like one of Heidi's, well, sixth, seventh, and eighth senses is like they are like, very rarely does Heidi do that exercise and the artist is like, oh, that's just some doodad, or like,
Mm.
oh, that's just blankety blank. Like they're very rarely dismissive of the thing that provokes our curiosity. It's oftentimes actually something that they've thought a lot about, or tried really hard to endeavor to, but something got in the way or got foiled, or they didn't have the infrastructure for it, or they didn't have the money to do it, or whatever the case may
Too
be.
many ideas
Yeah.
expressed in one thing, but I don't know, there's seeds there
Yeah.
for something. And I think too, because we spend a lot of time together, there's a lot of those kinds of visits that it's unspoken. We have like an unspoken language, and so we kind of we've come to this from really different experiences and backgrounds, and different design modes, but we over time we're attracted to some of those similar things. And so yeah, those kinds of off in the corner moments are like provocations to kind of like, let's talk about this more.
Yeah.
Like, what is it in here that there's something in here and we're not sure, but you're not sure, and let's speak about that more, because there's something to expand upon.
So to change the subject slightly, it's my understanding that Marta originally started as a typeface. That Benjamin, you designed a typeface for Heidi in graduate school for Heidi to set her graduate thesis in. Tell me about Marta, the typeface.
Type was the first thing that we sort of collaborated on. And so it didn't like have a name. Marta was but a glimmer in our eye. But oh yeah, the typeface was called American Pastoral. Yeah, I mean it had to do with like literally with my misremembering of the great painting, which is not even called American Pastoral. It's called the husband and wife with the husband
yeah, American Gothic. Yeah.
American Gothic. So it was literally my misremembering of that title of that painting, but imagining Heidi and I as the subjects of that painting. And then what did you think?
I thought that, well, when we first started collaborating, we also had first just met. And so there were just, there's that excitement about sharing ideas, collaborating, and all these things the first time. And there was like a sunniness to all of it. There was like, I mean, it's cheesy, but it is like, it felt pastoral in this way, and kind of fruitful and full of fields of flowers. And that I thought was also what shaped
I think inadvertently my misremembering is like because that time was so sort of I don't like it did involve like lots of jaunts out of New York City where we met, like into more bucolic pastoral places. And it was sort of summer into fall, and there was this really, I don't know, they're very kind of like you say, like sunny, optimistic.
So is American Pastoral what is now the like Marta typeface though, or are those different?
No,
those are the same. Okay.
This is essentially, yeah. The Marta
I was worried. I was like, how did I get this whole narrative off?
No.
Okay.
No. The foundation is totally accurate.
Okay.
When Heidi was in the midst of her thesis and was looking a lot, actually like experimental jet set and a bunch of Dutch graphic design. And I think, maybe using like a Helvetica or an Accidents or something like this. And I was sort of like, almost like in like a retrospective, like a courtship-y kind of like, so like, I can design you a typeface. You know what I mean? Like, you want something original to your thesis? I got you. And she was like, what?
I had never really heard about that. And, in the time that we've not known each other, I think about graphic design and language and type so much more, and how to express those ideas and how those ideas are aligned with the way that the letters actually look and how they're spaced and all of those things. But that was really eye-opening to me. And
and the construction of the typeface was kind of rooted in some of what Heidi was talking about.
Kind of understanding the ease of construction. There was a lot of talk about joinery and cherishability and kind of patination and things like that. And the typeface itself has these grotesque kind of chamfers and things.
Yeah. And I think like this idea of also like the thing that struck me about what Heidi was writing about at the time was like this idea of like an heirloom or something that lasts beyond itself or could be passed down. And I think we still lens a lot of the work that we show at Marta with this, like the idea that something is going to last, beyond our lives, if it's cared for, anyway, when we started our kind of like little design endeavor, which is called Norma,
Hmm.
predates in 2017 or so, we went back to the type as being like, oh, this is very, very logical that the first thing that we collaborate on together would actually like act as the foundation, the typographical foundation for for this new entity. So that carried over into Marta, and I zhuzhed up the type a little bit when we kind of like formalized the gallery, revisited it, and it was at that point that we sort of um, also looked at the word itself, or the name itself, I should say, and the repeating A letter forms,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
in the end designed kind of two different A's, one that was sort of more a stand-in for Heidi's personality or character or sensibility, and one that was more a stand-in for mine.
That's where I was going with the with the question a little bit is I was curious how a typeface designed for Heidi, your thesis, how you see that mapping to the work that you're doing now. And again, this is not a typography focused show. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the intricacy of letter forms, but I don't know, maybe because of this conversation that we're having, I do feel like the typeface speaks to a lot of the things that we're talking about. I think there's a weird kind of in betweenness of it. It in some ways it looks like a mashup of different things. It's kind of jumping between forms in some way. I think what you were talking about with heritage and this idea of the materiality and the tactility in some way. I guess I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on the typeface as a container for all of the ideas that Marta has now come to represent. If there's anything to that.
Totally. I think if when we opened the gallery in 2019, we felt like the type was contrary to our outlook, we would have like chosen something out of the box. And
Mm,
I think it's cool to look back and be like, oh, this thing that we set out, we actually like saw a lot of harmony in this thing that we made. And that maybe the idea of Marta has been kind of quietly fomenting in the background since we first
mm-hmm.
started seeing one another in 2013. I think that's potentially true, in some way or another, even from the start, when I really think back of like some of our shared kind of touchstones, in that early time of, um, you know certain strains of antiques, certain um outputs. Like we were always really into Jean Prouvé, and when I even think back of sort of his like high low, even like related to like his marketplace now of like making these humble things that are now not lensed as such or not considered as such, even like the way he put buildings together in this sort of systematic or jointed way, um not to make it all about Jean Prouvé, but like even our common touchstones from the
Yeah.
get-go had a rhyme in some of the things that we are still
Mm.
really fascinated by. We still we're looking back at the business card right now that I typeset in 2018 or 19 in the lead up to it, and it still rings true. I mean, it comes from this like place of Americana. It's a grotesque, um, and then it has all these kind of like quietly fussy bits.
Right. Right.
And I think that fussiness, or that like attention to detail that someone might not see, has definitely some symmetry with what we're talking about,
Yeah.
every day
Yeah.
now at the gallery.
I think that's
The
right.
care that might go unnoticed, but that the correct, not correct, that the attentive viewer will
Mm,
see
hmm.
and care for.
Yeah, the work kind of makes a feeling rather than it's like a scene kind of receipt of what you've done. I think a gallery doesn't need to have a custom type list. We don't, you know, it's like you don't need
That is true.
There's like all of this labor and I don't know, preoccupation goes into kind of everything we do, and maybe to the frustration of some of our collaborators because we're slow, like, you know, because
Yeah.
we really, it's not because we don't care, it's because we care too much. And so that I think translates into this feeling that maybe is out there,
Yeah.
but it's hard to measure, and we don't want an accounting of what that looks like, the time that it takes, and you know, all of that. I think, yeah, it maybe does go back to that generosity of spirit thing. It's
Yeah.
like we want to do as much as we can with the kind of skill set that we have.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah, but it always should be in the background and live in service to the artists and the work. It's really not meant to be a
Right.
brand or, you know,
Right.
that way.
Before Marta, you were collaborating together under the name Norma. You both have design backgrounds. Heidi, you in interior and furniture design, Benjamin, graphic design, typography. I'm curious how that work, how those backgrounds in design and in both of your respective design spaces, how did that inform what would become Marta? Or, you know, maybe on the flip side of that, are there things that you're doing now that you actually see the seeds of that in the design work you were doing? I'm kind of curious. It strikes me, not to over explain the question, but it strikes me that we're talking about your interest in artists who go on a side quest, that in some ways that kind of describes both of you also. And I'm curious about that.
I mean, I think that, you know, coming from the background of design in various respects has always made us really empathetic to the artists that we work with, and kind of what it takes to realize a body of work that you know, we don't treat the work as a commodity. It really is about going on that journey and
Mm,
development and making sure that that process and production is that time is sacred and you know, is given as much kind of protection from the commercial aspect of the gallery. But there was other parts to that.
Yeah. I think it baffles my mind sometimes because design is so much a part of how we present work
mm,
to the world in terms of being really deliberate and about exhibition making, being really cognizant of the way an image is transmitted, whether that's the way the photograph was taken or the angle at which the artwork was documented, or even the ratio of its crop as an image. These are all like little quiet considerations, and sometimes it really baffles my mind or boggles my mind that like that not every gallery has the luxury of an ostensible in-house graphic designer,
mm,
or the luxury of someone who has worked in spaces for
mhm.
more than a decade,
Yeah.
and the making of spaces and the creation of yeah, interior spaces or dialogues of different works from different sources. That's wild to me. I feel like that foundation that both of us have, we use every day in the presentation of excellent works of art and design, that happen to be able to shine a little bit better, in our humble opinion, when they're presented deliberately. And there's plenty of galleries that do as good of a job as us and better, but there's also a number of galleries who show great work who are less sensitive to those
Hmm.
questions. Um, and it doesn't make the work any less good, but I feel really grateful that we've come at it from these previous backgrounds and from these kind of angles or even interests, like what intrigues us about the
Yeah.
presentation work. I think that part's really fun and really exciting. It doesn't really feel like work even. And yeah, so I think those backgrounds help us every day, and are maybe even kind of like um, not why we got into it, but why we had the confidence to get into
Hmm.
it.
I hope this does not sound like a reductive question. Do you still identify as designers?
No, which is interesting
Yeah,
because
why?
of course we are, but but we use it less and less as an identifier. It's
Be-
almost like
because
we're
there are better terms, because it feels like
no,
you're doing
you
it
know,
less.
I
maybe
think
it's just because we're
because
doing it
we're,
less, or
yeah,
we're doing it on
doing
behalf of different things.
publicly, or yeah, as kind of a pure. I think it's different too because, as you said, your background was like client
Mhm.
relationship focused, and I think that was how we kind of identified that role of designer for the
Yeah,
longest time.
is as service,
Right.
Mhm.
And
and
it is
now
in service of
it's
something
in
else, but
service, but it's not as service.
Right. Right.
And like we are now in service of these works that we have the pleasure and the honor of showing, but the artist is not commissioning us
Right.
or to
Right.
do this. It's sort of like it's just a sort of like a bonus of showing with the gallery is you get more like kind of care and attention than you maybe even bargained for.
That change from being design as service to design as being in service, do you feel like doing the work you're doing now, working with artists, visiting studios, all the other kind of new things that you have learned how to do and are doing, does that has that changed how you think about design, or the design that you do in service of these artists? Does that change actually what you actually do when you're setting type or designing the space?
It definitely does. I mean, and you can maybe speak about like spaces and interiors when I have the opportunity to make graphic design now, whether it's for the gallery or on the rare occasion like for a sort of I don't know commission
Hmm.
or that's kind of too good to pass up. Generally, not from a budgetary standpoint, but from a sort of like content
Hmm.
standpoint. Um, I am much more deferential to the
Mm.
content and the work than I ever was when I was authoring graphic design.
Yeah.
Uh, in terms of like, feeling like I had to sort of um, have some bombast to cut through the noise, maybe. Now I really do feel like I'm much happier to take a back seat or make the thing just truly in service, less about like the designer dialoguing with the content and
Hmm.
more
Hmm.
or servicing it or getting out of its way. um when I mean, I was thinking about the way that like in the couple sort of like moments of interiors that you've been able to do, like we're thinking a lot about incorporating artists' work. It's much less about
Ah.
sort of like presenting. We worked on a small project last summer that was almost like an art advising project that turned into a small interiors project. And I think maybe this is not new to Heidi, but it was new to me where we were thinking much less about what we could find to put into the room and much more about what work like felt at home in that place. And also like potentially did we have some really nice like relationships with artists where we could commission something from them that was really site specific and really like you know particular to that
Mhm.
space or to that architecture or to that light or to that um, geography. And I think even in that sense, it was much less about sort of like shopping for this person who had hired us to make a room for them, and much
Yeah.
more about sort of almost like creating a little livable exhibition, permanently livable exhibition inside of, in this case, a dining room. Like,
Yeah, it makes me consider stewardship a lot more, and the context in which the pieces get placed. With a background in interiors, you are kind of required to select a lot of pieces to kind of fill a space, and really sometimes the harmony of that can get lost. And so I think, yeah, really understanding kind of the collection that the pieces will end up in and who will be the kind of
keeper.
next keeper and care for the works is important, and something that probably is much more enhanced now that we have this space.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way to wrap up too. And so for my last question, I want to loop back to the beginning and to this kind of idea that helped in the early years of Marta. This idea of designers exploring the abandonment of function, which I know it's only 80% accurate now. There's this much blurrier definition, but I'm interested in this idea of side quests, of artists going, jumping from one thing to the next, designers abandoning function. Thinking about the artists and designers you've worked with, I'm wondering if you've experienced how how making a space for artists and designers and people in between to show that work that they couldn't show anywhere else, has that changed their practice in any way? Has that opened up new things for your artists? I'm really interested in this value of jumping from one thing, to a parallel thing, to going on that side quest, to abandoning function. Um, have you seen how that's opened up other things, how that has become generative beyond the work that you've actually shown?
Yes, I think, sometimes what inevitably happens is that the side quest becomes the main quest.
Yeah, yeah.
And then other times the side quest can remain as such, or the learning from that is that like, wow, this was really resonant to me as the artist, or and you
Mm,
guys as the people that put on this work, but not resonant to the marketplace. You know what I
mm,
mean? And sometimes an artist then has to decide whether to kind of stay the course, um, in that body of work, or sometimes tragically or realistically, that side quest has to remain as such, or remain something more ephemeral, because the marketplace responds to other bodies of work. You know what I
mm,
mean? I think that's another like palpable learning. You know what I mean? Is
mm.
that you we can't make we can't make or host work in a vacuum. Like we always joke that like everyone has to live to fight another day. So that's one of the reasons that this beautiful thing also functions as a business, is just so that everyone can keep doing what they have grown to love.
Well, and I think too, sometimes, there's like a real interest in the business aspect for immediacy and kind of resolution or gratification quickly. And, sometimes these side quests are percolations that maybe
Mm,
we don't know yet.
Yeah,
We don't know what
yeah.
might catch someone's eye, and what could happen later. But I do think that it is generative, because I think it encourages more expansive thought
yeah,
and experimentation, which is good for creativity wholesale.
yeah. And I think sometimes it'll also, it might not be that, again, just to continue with the metaphor, it might not be that side quest that ends up becoming the main quest, but it might mean that that work or that object or that exploration or that sketch that was relegated in that artist's mind, they might pay the tiniest bit more attention to, something that might have previously gone, uh,
Right.
over in that corner.
Or even
Um,
the courage to
yeah,
kind of
Yeah.
exactly.
honor that a bit more, or explore it.
Right. Um, Yeah, so I think, and I think, perhaps if that weren't the case, if we weren't seeing the benefits of that provocation,
Mm,
um, it might be a much less rewarding endeavor. I think that's maybe at the core of it, is that we're seeing an artist practice sort of more for change, or maybe it's sort of become the thing it always wanted to be, whatever that means.
yeah.
And that's what sort of keeps us excited and keeps everyone coming back for more.
I think that's a great way to wrap up this conversation, Benjamin and Heidi. This was so nice. I really love what you're doing, and the things that you are platforming and making space for, I think is very important. Thanks so much for being on the show.
It's
Thanks for
our
having us.
total pleasure. Thank you for having us. And it's been a great conversation and some really nice provoking questions that will similarly sit with us for a while.
That was my conversation with Marta's Heidi Korsavong and Benjamin Critton. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Choop. The show is funded thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you like what we're doing, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast. You can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.